What if the man who once refused to take accountability is suddenly on a full-blown apology tour and no one knows why? Cody Brown's shift has left Janelle questioning everything, Christine standing guarded, and viewers wondering whether this is true redemption or the ultimate image reset. Because when apologies come this late and this public, there is always more beneath the surface. Stay with me until the end, because what unfolds next changes everything. And if you love deep dives with zero filter real talk, hit that subscribe button right now and join the fastest growing reality breakdown community on YouTube. The moment Cody Brown began what many are calling his apology tour, the atmosphere around the family shifted in a way that felt almost surreal, because this is a man who for years appeared unwavering in his stance, firm in his convictions, and often resistant to accepting responsibility. Yet, suddenly, he is sitting down with former partners, offering words of regret and reflection, and that abrupt transformation has left everyone, including viewers, questioning what truly sparked this change. Janelle Brown, in particular, seemed caught off guard when he approached her with an emotional intensity that felt layered, almost rehearsed, as if each sentence had been carefully considered long before it was spoken. And instead of reacting with immediate gratitude, she processed it slowly, visibly trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the one she had known during years of tension, distance, and unresolved conflict. Their history has not been simple. It has been marked by disagreements about family priorities, finances, communication, and loyalty. And for a long time, it seemed as though both had accepted a certain emotional distance as permanent. So when Cody suddenly expressed sorrow for his anger and acknowledged mistakes, it felt less like a natural progression and more like a dramatic pivot that demanded explanation. Janelle even half-jokingly asked whether he had joined a 12-step program, because the structured process of making amends is one of the most recognizable elements of that path. And when someone begins systematically apologizing for past behavior, it can mirror that framework. Her question lingered in the air, not necessarily as an accusation, but as a reflection of how unexpected the entire encounter felt. Because meaningful accountability typically unfolds gradually through consistent behavior, not in one sweeping emotional speech. And the intensity of his words left her needing time to decompress, which in itself says something about how heavy the moment felt. She described the apology as thick, almost overwhelming, suggesting that it carried more weight than she anticipated, and perhaps more than she fully trusted. And that hesitation is rooted in history, because their relationship endured years of strain, where voices were raised, boundaries were tested, and misunderstandings hardened into resentment. So a sudden wave of humility naturally invites skepticism, especially when public perception has recently been critical of his actions and choices. Viewers have watched the breakdown of family unity unfold over multiple seasons, observing arguments that centered on fairness, respect, parenting decisions, and emotional availability. And during those conflicts, Cody often presented himself as misunderstood and burdened by expectations, rather than as someone contributing to the dysfunction. So this new posture of regret contrasts sharply with that earlier narrative, and the question becomes whether this is genuine growth or a strategic recalibration of image. The involvement of Robin Brown adds another layer to the dynamic, because she appears to frame the apology not merely as a relational repair, but as a spiritual journey, emphasizing themes of redemption, divine guidance, and moral accountability. And when an apology is positioned as a calling or mission, it subtly shifts how it can be critiqued, because rejecting it might be interpreted as rejecting growth itself. And that reframing can influence how audiences perceive those who respond cautiously. Christine Brown, in particular, approached her meeting with Cody with visible composure, bringing her husband David not as a participant in the conversation, but as a source of support, which speaks volumes about her boundaries and her awareness of past patterns. The history between Christine and Cody includes moments that were emotionally charged and at times uncomfortable, and her decision to ensure she was not alone reflects a desire for stability rather than confrontation. Cody, however, suggested that he invited David out of respect for the marriage, implying a traditional perspective on interactions between former spouses. And that assertion has been debated by viewers, who question whether it was a genuine gesture of courtesy or a reframing of the situation to maintain control of the narrative. When he finally delivered his apology to Christine, it centered on regret for his anger and for saying he did not love her, words that carried significant emotional weight during previous seasons. Yet her response was measured. She stated that the past was behind her, indicating that she had already processed those wounds and moved forward into a healthier chapter of her life. That calm reaction may not have provided the emotional payoff he expected, and in that subtle disappointment, some viewers sensed that the apology might have been tied to a desire for validation rather than solely for closure, because true amends are offered without expectation of a specific reaction, and Christine's demeanor suggested she no longer needed his acknowledgement to validate her healing. She has built a new life with David, one that appears supportive, balanced, and grounded, and that independence shifts the power dynamic significantly. For years, the family structure revolved around shared decisions and collective identity, but now each individual is defining their own path, and Cody's apology tour intersects with that transformation at a time when custody discussions, financial arrangements, and co-parenting boundaries are still being navigated, which adds complexity to the timing. Skeptics argue that if remorse were the sole motivation, it might have occurred earlier, before relationships reached such public fracture. And yet, personal growth can emerge unpredictably, sometimes catalyzed by loss, sometimes by reflection, sometimes by facing consequences. And without direct confirmation of his internal motivations, the audience is left interpreting tone, body language, and consistency across episodes. Janelle's mention of a 12-step program continues to resonate because it hints at the possibility of deeper introspection, perhaps even struggles that have not been openly addressed on screen. Those speculations should remain cautious given the lack of verified information. What remains evident is that apologies delivered in a public forum carry additional weight. They are not only messages to the recipients, but also to the viewers, shaping how history is remembered and how responsibility is assigned. And that dual audience complicates authenticity, because even sincere remorse can be overshadowed by suspicion when cameras are present. The broader theme emerging from this chapter is the tension between image and integrity, between spoken regret and demonstrated change. Viewers have seen moments in the past where accountability seemed partial or redirected, and so they watch closely now for consistency in future interactions. Will communication with his children improve? Will co-parenting become smoother? Will financial obligations be handled transparently? These tangible actions will ultimately determine whether this apology tour marks a genuine turning point or a temporary adjustment under scrutiny. The emotional stakes are high because fractured family bonds leave lasting impact, not only on the adults involved, but on the children who have witnessed the conflict and public discourse surrounding their lives. So the narrative unfolding is about more than reputation. It is about rebuilding trust. And trust cannot be demanded. It must be earned gradually through reliability and respect. And as the season progresses, each conversation becomes a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing whether humility will be sustained beyond initial meetings. The suspense lies not in the words already spoken, but in what follows, because transformation, if real, will manifest in quieter moments, in consistent behavior away from dramatic scenes. And if it is performative, inconsistencies will eventually surface, and the audience, attuned to nuance, will notice the difference. Thus, part 1 of this unfolding story leaves us suspended between skepticism and cautious optimism, observing a man who claims reflection, listening to women who respond with measured restraint, and waiting to see whether apology evolves into action or fades into another chapter of unresolved tension. As the apology tour continues, the emotional undercurrent grows heavier because what initially seemed like isolated conversations now feels like a coordinated attempt to rewrite a complicated history. And the more Cody Brown speaks, the more viewers analyze not only what he says, but what he avoids saying. Because in every apology, there is the surface statement, and then there is the deeper layer of accountability that either confirms sincerity or exposes hesitation. And in these meetings, that deeper layer often feels just out of reach. He expresses regret for anger, for harsh words, for moments that looked bad on camera. Yet when it comes to the structural issues that fractured the family, the prolonged emotional absence, the imbalance of time and attention, the choices that left certain children feeling sidelined, those acknowledgments remain less defined. And that gap is where skepticism thrives, because growth is not only about recognizing that tempers flared, it is about confronting patterns that allowed resentment to grow unchecked for years. And when Janelle reflected on her meeting, she described feeling overwhelmed, almost as if the performance of remorse was so intense that it required emotional recovery time. And that reaction is telling, because authentic apologies tend to create clarity, whereas overlayered ones can create confusion, especially when history contradicts the sudden humility. She has long been independent, practical, and measured, rarely swayed by dramatic gestures, and her instinct to question whether this was influenced by a structured recovery model hints at how out of character it seemed for him to initiate amends without defensiveness. That single comment about a 12-step framework continues to echo, because such programs demand brutal honesty and surrender of ego, and viewers who have watched Cody over the years know that ego has often been a defining trait, not necessarily malicious, but pronounced and visible. So the idea of him quietly engaging in a process that requires vulnerability would represent a profound shift. Yet no confirmation has surfaced, leaving the speculation suspended between possibility and narrative device. Meanwhile, Robin's presence hovers like a strategic advisor, reinforcing language about purpose and spiritual awakening, subtly steering the conversation away from public perception and toward divine intention. And that framing serves a dual function, because if this is about faith and growth, then criticism can be dismissed as misunderstanding of the journey. And that positioning creates a protective layer around the apology tour, shielding it from accusations of image management. Yet, timing remains a persistent question, because these gestures arrive after seasons of tension, after relationships dissolved, after legal discussions around custody and support emerged. And when apologies coincide with heightened scrutiny, dimension but accountability to children involves consistency, reliability, and acknowledgement of specific grievances. And viewers have witnessed scenes where some children voice disappointment about time, attention, and perceived favoritism. So if this apology tour is truly comprehensive, it must extend beyond symbolic meetings and into everyday interactions that demonstrate change. Otherwise, it risks being perceived as selective, focusing on high-visibility reconciliations while deeper wounds remain unaddressed. And the audience, increasingly sophisticated in analyzing reality narratives, recognizes that redemption arcs require sustained follow-through, moments of humility when cameras are absent, gestures of repair that do not coincide with publicity. And perhaps that is why suspense remains so strong, because no definitive answer has emerged, only hints and interpretations, body language, pauses, tone shifts, each becoming clues in a larger puzzle. Some viewers feel cautiously hopeful, believing that reflection can arrive even after years of conflict. Others remain doubtful, pointing to historical defensiveness and narrative reframing as indicators that this could be temporary, and both perspectives coexist, fueling discussion and engagement. What makes this storyline compelling is not simply whether the apologies are accepted, but whether transformation, if genuine, can withstand pressure. Because change tested by criticism reveals its durability, and as episodes unfold, subtle patterns will either reinforce sincerity or unravel it. Will language remain consistent? Will responsibility broaden? Will empathy replace justification? These markers will ultimately determine how this chapter is remembered. For now, the family stands at an intersection where past grievances meet present attempts at closure, and future relationships hang in balance. And that tension is palpable in every exchange, every measured response, every carefully chosen word. The apology tour has opened doors, but whether those doors lead to reconciliation or merely a brief pause in long-standing conflict remains uncertain. And that uncertainty keeps viewers invested, analyzing each development, searching for evidence of growth or signs of performance, knowing that in stories like this, truth is revealed not through grand declarations, but through steady, repeated action over time. At the end of the day, this is bigger than one apology. It is about patterns, accountability, and whether real change can actually last when the cameras stop rolling. The words have been spoken, but the real proof will come in actions, consistency, and how relationships evolve from here. So the question remains, is this redemption or reputation repair? If you want the full truth as it unfolds, make sure you subscribe right now and join the conversation, because we break it down like no one else, and you do not want to miss what happens next.